Good morning, Miss Michelle Gray. How are you doing? And
I'm
welcome
doing
to
good.
all you beautiful people out there who are now joining our channel. We've got Michelle Gray, whose information is in the description box below. She is going to be telling my beautiful son, Erik Medhus, who is going to talk about people pleasing. How sometimes we don't listen to our body when our body says no, abort, abort, abort. Hi, Erik. I love you.
He says, "Hi, Mama. I love you too." And he's this morning when he came in, he came running in this morning, and he's like, I see him in my third eye, so he came running and put his face right up, like right up, really close, and he's got a red hat on, and he's got this really what looks like a big comfy hoodie, like a kind of a gray or maybe an off-white kind of hoodie because he looks very cozy.
Oh.
So he's pulling himself up, um, and he's saying, "Mom, this is a really important topic because he says that so much is connected to people pleasing." And so he says, "So let's dive into it a little bit and figure out and talk to everybody about not only what it's doing by continuing to people please, but what we can do to change it, what we can do to grow from it."
Okay.
So, do you want to ask questions or do you want him to just go?
Well, we could just let you go first, and that will stimulate me to. And I do have some questions in my mind.
Okay.
Hopefully, I'll hold on to you.
Okay. So he says, to start with, he says, well, what exactly is it? He says, most people that are listening to this already know if they have that people pleasing tendency. And he says that actually all of us human beings, because he says so many things have a spectrum. It's not really one or the other, but that society conditions us to begin with to play like these social hoops throughout our life. We learn from a child to please. He goes, think about school, parents, school, community. It's always, be on your best behavior and don't say this or don't do this. So he says from a very early age, we learn what to do and what not to do, what's going to get a bad reaction, what's going to get a good reaction from people. But he says this is a spectrum because some people are able to navigate through that. And then there's others of us, and he says many of us that have been, myself included, gone through emotional neglect
Yeah.
or some kind of emotional abuse. And I will explain an example. When I was a kid through school, I went through years of torment from other kids and some teachers as well. And a lot of it was like I didn't know from one day to the next whether I would be by myself or if I'd have friends.
Ugh.
So I'd come to school and like this is from, maybe 9 years old, 8 years old. And at that time, a lot of the teachers, my parents included, buck up, Michelle. You're too sensitive. You need to toughen up. You've got to cut this out. Or, I go to the teachers and say, like, I'm being harassed, I'm being teased because they'd come together as groups
Oh
and would
gosh.
tease me. And then they'd say, okay, today we're not going to talk to Michelle. And so I'd be like, well, what's
Oh,
wrong? Like, what did I do? And they just pretend I wasn't there. And so what Erik is saying is that there's many people that can um, understand this, whether this was something that occurred in their home or with siblings,
yeah.
with peers. And he says that had a very profound and deep effect on me because I was never able to. Oh, well, that's true too. He says, so a lot of us are also empaths.
Yeah.
And he says, so coming in sensitive and then also going through this type of situation, not having our emotional needs met, we learned at a very young age how to navigate and read people. And
Yeah.
he says now, he goes, for those of us that are either former people pleasers or still are, he says you're also probably really good at reading the room, at figuring out what,
Oh God.
you
Yeah.
know, how do I match myself to this person? And he goes, and for that, that's actually one of the lessons that comes with us and going through this is that empathy. He says being able to he goes, being able to identify and see from our perspective and somebody else's perspective. Because, and that's true, Erik just says, right, Michelle, because that's what really amped up my ability to, to be able to read people, because I did it every day over and
Yeah.
over and over so
Right.
that I could keep myself safe. And
Mm.
that's what he says it boils down to. It's safety. It's keeping ourselves safe. So he says, people pleasing, even though he says it also goes with martyrship, because he says that there's like different ends of the spectrum. So sometimes people pleasing can turn into,
Martyrdom.
I'm doing this for you, so you must, appreciate me because I'm giving up everything. But he
Mm.
says the truth about people pleasing, no matter where it is on the spectrum, is a need is looking to be met, whether we're conscious of it or not. He says there's a need being met, and that need is generally acceptance, validation, um, and avoiding rejection.
Yeah.
And so, do you have a question? Do you have a
Well,
question he's thinking?
it gets down to a pack animal mentality. We're pack animals, so we need to feel like we belong to the pack, and you can do that by begging for it, conforming, pleasing, or you can do it by giving some sort of meaningful contribution to the pack, so that
Mm-hmm.
then you don't beg for it, but you actually earn pack acceptance. So I think it's a pack animal thing in some
Well,
regard.
he says that's true. That's true because there is an animal instinct to it. And he says, Mom, that is true. But he's also saying that it's when it becomes toxic in one's life that it's a problem.
Yeah.
So he says that when you're people pleasing as your means of survival, and he's giving an example of somebody that is coming into a family that feels very invalidated in how they are and their natural sensitivity, and there's no one in their family that understands them. And so they start to feel like no matter what I do, it's never good enough. Because he says the truth about people pleasing is you will never ever be able to please others on the
Yeah.
outside of you if you're relying on it for your acceptance. No matter what you do, he says it will never ever be enough. But he says when there's that child, or that child that grows up in a family that is looking for validation, like especially if they are different than the rest of their family. So he
Mhm.
says you may have a family full of scientists that are very logic minded,
Mhm.
uh, mathematicians, and this person that is trying to please to get acceptance may be an amazing artist, but that family does not really validate art. They think, well, that's nice, but that's not really like what we do.
Yeah.
And so it never is validated in that person's life. So that person grows up feeling like something that is natural with them is not good enough. Something that they have inside them is not good enough. And he says, and then that starts to spin into other things, because he says that starts to get into resentment. And he says, and that's when it starts to turn, he's saying sour in the body, is when we start to get resentment, or we're continuously going on that search, because he says it's how the brain is programmed. It's a cycle, it's a pattern. So he says many people throughout their life are continuing this pattern. And then he goes, where it gets toxic is when we start to move aside our own likes, dislikes for other people's continuously. Because and yes, he says that is self-esteem. So that
Yeah.
hits the self-esteem. He goes, so really people pleasing is like, well, two words that we're using that have all these offshoots of other
Yeah. And then
emotions
self-loathing. And
and
what is that?
feelings.
That brings
Yes,
about disease, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual
yes,
diseases. So yeah.
yes.
So do you think that empaths are generally more likely to become people pleasers?
He says yes. There's also a higher volume of female versus male.
Yeah, I was going
So
to
he
ask
says
why. That was another question, but let's ask why is it that empaths tend to be people pleasers? Because they read the room and see people's needs that need to be met more easily, or what?
yes, he says that's right, Mom. So he goes, really, he goes, So you're empathic, you're highly sensitive, and as we've talked before, he says we come in with our vibration is a little more open. So our sensitivity level is higher than, say, somebody else beside us. So we've got that natural ability. So he goes, you include that with that reading the room for safety. So it's like something natural that we do that we're actually practicing and getting better at.
Mm.
He says through the situations that yeah, he's speaking really fast, through the situations that may be painful. And he goes, and this is the part where it's the adversity that we experience is really giving us a lot of power if we're able to flip that.
Yeah. Okay. So why women? I think we're sort of groomed. Okay, your daddy's coming home. Go get his slippers and oh god, and things
Yeah,
like that.
he says, well, the nature, he says, like, nurture, caregivers. He
Yeah.
goes, many of us have that through, generations. He says very generational as well.
Mm,
So many of us have watched our parent or our grandparents, the mother is the caregiver of the home or
yeah.
taking care of everybody's needs. And he says, and also for a very long time, it was the mother that would sacrifice her own whatever she wanted for the
Mm.
sake of her children. And he says, and not to say, he goes, now for those of you that are saying, well, I do that for my children, I would do that, he goes, that's not saying that that's a bad thing. What it's saying is if you're putting your everything
Oh
into
yeah.
somebody else or your only identity into that, that's where
Yeah.
it becomes a problem for us.
Put
But
your
he
own
says, yeah,
oxygen mask on first, because if you get sick emotionally, spiritually, physically, you're not going to be any help to those you are trying to take care of.
that's right. That's right. And he goes, it's really giving the opposite effect. And
Right.
that's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah. So do people tend to have radars that pick out people like, well, when you were a kid, people who are empaths, do they sense that and then vulnerable attack, you're the little um antelope, that the gazelle that can't quite keep up. Let's attack.
Yeah. So he says if you think about like if we just look at, say, childhood and through
Yeah,
school, he says a lot of kids that would gravitate to, say, poking what they might think is the weaker link is because it's an easy target. And he
yeah,
says it goes right down to that very simple, I'm going to project my pain or my ability to control, to look better, to feel better around others. And he says is usually with kids it's very simple. So these kids might be experiencing something at home where their control is being taken away or
yeah.
their power is being taken away, so they're looking to exert that power in whatever way that they can
Mhm.
at school over other kids, so they look at that as a weakness.
Okay. How do we handle people who would like what would have been good advice to give little Michelle, how to handle people like that?
Well, he says, first of all, communication was shut down. So he says, speak up and don't stop speaking up. He says, if one person doesn't listen to you, you go to the next. So he goes, he's speaking specifically in treatment, like how I was being treated. And he says, but on that personal level, he said that at the age that I was, what would have been beneficial for me would have been to have someone that was able to help validate my feelings. And he says, this is why it's so important as parents, as caregivers, to validate how our children feel, even if it may seem nonsensical to you, because he's just saying oh, it's no big deal, kids all do this, kids make fun of each other, kids
Oh
do
yeah.
these kinds of things. He says when you're not receiving validation, he goes, then it comes back on the child as, well, then there is something wrong with me,
Oh yeah.
that this is all my fault, I'm doing something wrong, I'm not good enough, I'm going to hide these things about me, I'm not going to show them these personality traits or these, so he's saying that the child starts to go inward. So he says for me it would have been continuing to speak up. and look for an adult, look for somebody that was able to assist me, to help me validate how I felt.
Yeah. See, my daughter, Michelle, went through the same thing where they were just this one ringleader bully would, like, when she sat at the table and lunch for middle school, she would instruct everybody to get their trays and leave and move, leaving her all alone. So what do you do to people like that as a child? How would, for example, my Michelle or you have handled, let's not speak to her today, let's get up and move to a different table? What do you do to people like that, to your peers?
Well, he says it's very challenging for a child to go through this because this is really when adults need to step in. He says an adult needs to step in and help diffuse that situation, because he's actually saying with Michelle, like, there were teachers or others that didn't take it seriously,
Mm.
that didn't really look
Yeah.
at it as a really big issue. So, and they expressed that to Michelle,
Mm. Yeah, she
like
ended
they
up being, and
kind of gave her
they
that
didn't tell me
sense. And he
about it.
says
She
Michelle
didn't
was
tell me
always
about
very,
it. Yeah, she didn't tell me about it. I found out later that she was sometimes having to have lunch in the nurse's office. It's like
yes,
ridiculous.
yes.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, because that's why he says communication is really important, because he says going to the other kids now, he says that does need to be dealt with, and it has to be dealt with as something that's just as serious, because he says there's so much focus on physical abuse,
Yeah,
and there's not enough focus on emotional abuse still
that's
today.
true. That's true.
So he says, because it's very damaging and it holds on for a very long time, because it sets up those patterns into teenage and adulthood
Yeah,
as well.
absolutely.
So he said that communication really important, and to have adults become involved to communicate this to the other children and give them consequences for their behavior, to show them that, you know, their behaviors and how that hurts others is just as dangerous as had they have gone up and kicked her in the knees. Erik says,
Yeah,
he goes, it's the same thing, it does the
yeah,
same thing, just because you can't see one scar over the other.
that's right. So, how do you identify either yourself or one of your children as a people pleaser that's dysfunctional people pleasing?
Well, he says one telltale sign, if you're a people pleaser, chances are you're not grounded in yourself. So you may have issues with overwhelm, consistent overwhelm. And
Yeah,
he says, and that starts to become a normal. So your cortisol levels, your
oh,
everything is heightened. So when something happens that is unexpected, it blows apart everything. So he says, and why is that? Because he says, well, he goes, if you're dealing with other people's shit, if you're trying to make everybody else happy all the time, and you're jumping these hoops to, well, I committed to this and I said I'd do this, and if I don't do this, this person's going to be happy, and then it's going to affect this over here. He says you'll find that the people pleaser is way busier than what they need to be. They're
yeah,
doing too much. And he says, and the problem is they feel that they can't condense that or slow that down, because, well, he goes, if they do, it's going to take some kind of emotional hit. They're going to upset somebody, they're going to
they don't
hurt
want to
somebody, they're going to
disappoint.
disappoint.
Yes,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. So he says, but if you see this also in your child, he goes, well, number one, communicate with your child. Make sure that you're asking, how did your day go? And just asking, tell me about your conversations with your friends.
yeah,
Tell, give me one example, because you can start to pick out where you can see, because you know your child at home. And he says, so you can start to see where your child might be avoiding their own, how they are, their own decisions, and going along with another child. Now he says there's a certain amount of that which is their growth and how they're able to identify themselves. And
yeah.
sometimes he goes, kids do go along with other kids and that's how they learn. But he says it's when you see your child continuously putting themselves last,
Oh,
or putting somebody else above them, he goes, then you want to address that, you want to help work with them. And he says it's very important that if you're working with a child, or anyone really that has been doing this, is not to come at them with any shame, not to come at them and say, you know, like, you can't keep doing this. Look what you're doing to yourself. And because he says somebody that has a lot of people pleasing in them, whether this is a child or someone that's been doing it for many years, already feels that inside. They already feel shame for many different reasons, and they feel a lot of guilt. And especially if they feel like they've that's true, like Erik says, realizing when you realize you've made yourself sick, or when things start to fall
Yeah.
apart, all that guilt and that shame, he says this is a path also to self-forgiveness. So it's really
Mm,
important that he goes, you remember that that person is shaming and beating themselves up enough. So think about that as you address and you talk to them about what's going on.
exactly. So, I could tell that when I used to be more of a people pleaser, I would just feel emotionally drained. I mean, I've given away all my emotional resources, and there's emotional vampires out there that do suck people pleasers dry, basically.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and you just feel their energies like big stuck
Yes,
in the
and
ground.
he says, and the thing is he says there tends to be an area where it can bring a lot of resentment. So he says if you're hearing this right now, and he goes, many people will be hearing this and be able to identify those people that have either been in their life or are in their life that suck them dry. Because he says when you're operating for somebody else, you are not replenishing yourself. You're not using your own resources from source. He says it's energy that's sourcing through somebody else for validation for whatever reasons. And so that starts to creation. You're not grounded or aligned in yourself.
That's right. Interesting. I know that Annika, when your youngest sister, when she was quite little, her best friend was the across the street little girl who was about a year older, I think, and she was just like, I remember watching them, and Brianna said, "I'm going home if you don't play what I want to play. This is the game we're going to play." And Annika was like, "Okay, bye, see ya." Like, don't let the door hit you in the vagina on your way out. I mean, she was really good about it. She's like, okay, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, she tried to make her into a people pleaser, but that didn't work.
Yeah. Yeah. And he says, and some people are really good at that.
Yeah,
And he says, and it when we can say no, and when we can be okay, he says, detached from consequences, or detached from whatever that other person's um feelings, or what they try to push back on you for guilt.
yeah.
And I have so many examples, like Erik's showing me so many
Mm,
things that I've experienced in my own life, but he's also commenting about when we are on our path of healing. And as we heal this, as we heal people pleasing, and he says, and this is a process, right?
yeah,
He says it's not something that happens quickly. He says it's a process. And he says it is hard. It's not easy to do, because it does take us to slow down and to yes, he says it takes a lot of emotional energy at first to really identify it, but he says it then gets easier. But here's the thing, he says, keep in mind that there's going to be people that are used to you the way that you've always been, even though you know on your healing path that that was never really you, as
right.
you identify that within yourself. And he says, so these people have always built you up to be what they have perceived you to be. And so when you start to put in boundaries, when you start to say no, when you start to say,
Oh,
when
oh my
I
God, you're
feel,
turning into a bitch.
yes, and that is something I experienced. I had many
Mm,
people turn their back on me and just be
yeah.
like, who are you?
Oh,
Like, you're not the same person. Or when they see me, they want to bring up all the things that I used to do years
mm,
ago, because there's nothing they can say now because they don't know who I am.
yeah.
Right?
So what do
So
you do? Because you say, look, to your friends and those around you, like, okay, look, I've done a lot of self-reflection. I realize I'm just giving everything away, and I need to protect myself and put on my own oxygen mask first. So you're going to notice a change in me. I'm going to have to be respectful and protective of my resources. So
Yes, and Erik just says, and Erik's worked with me a great deal through this whole process because it's been 7 years of really intense changes.
Yeah.
And so for some people, yes, that was the appropriate, and I could have that conversation because they could see the changes and the benefit. But then there's other people that Erik had said to me, they do see the benefit. They do see you growing and changing, but it triggers them
Yeah.
and it doesn't make them feel good. So they'd rather pick out the things that they think you should do or aren't doing right. So it gives them some temporary satisfaction
Mm.
to say, oh, she's not all this or she's not, when that's really not what it's about anyway. So Erik says in
Yeah.
those moments, he's like, when you've got a situation like that, he goes, it's okay to just nod your head and smile and change the
Yeah.
subject. You don't have to explain. He goes, you don't need to defend yourself and explain. But he goes, again,
Yeah, that's
that's
people pleasing right there. If you feel like
it
you can
is.
defend yourself.
Exactly. And he
Yeah.
says, this is where you get into the discernment of where am I going to spend my energy? I mean, do I want to spend all my energy explaining to somebody who really is just going to nod their head and smile, but beneath it, they don't really care what
Yeah.
I'm doing because it upsets them? So he says, then is also, he goes, and this is hard. We start to really find out who's really there for us,
Yeah.
and he goes, and that's why a lot of us through our healing path and our awakening path, we tend to tighten up our friend circles. We start to move through people that maybe were, and he goes, and that doesn't mean these people are bad or anything. He goes, but they were good for you at one time in your life. It served a purpose at that time, but you're going in different directions.
Right.
You're not in the same space anymore. So it's the awareness and the acceptance that that's okay.
Yeah.
They don't have to like you or like what you're doing as long as you do. Because he
Yeah.
says,
Trying to call the herd.
yes,
Right.
he says removing people pleasing, mom, is the deepest forms of self-love. That's what it gets us to.
Oh, wow. Interesting. So, what's some tips on how to best relinquish our people pleasing role?
So he says, number one, awareness. He says, so
Yeah.
having the awareness that I engage in people pleasing activities.
Yeah.
So he says, and that takes some slowing things down. But he goes, the great news is you can use your day to day life as your examples if you're willing to be the observer, if you're able to slow yourself down enough to be able to say, okay, I can feel this in me. And he goes, and most of us listening to this know when they're doing it.
Yeah.
They can feel it when they're doing it. So he says, identify it. Then he says, ask yourself, why am I doing this thing? He goes, really go into it and follow. Why am I doing this? He goes, if you need to write it down on a piece of paper, write it down. He goes, why am I doing this? Is this something that is for the greater good? Because he goes, sometimes you will do something that maybe isn't like, well, it's not the top thing for me, but it is going to be better in the end for everybody. He
Right.
goes, so you really want to start to work through that situation. Now, if you're finding that, he goes, because you'll find your difficulty by going slowly down, you'll find that it comes down to, I just don't want this person to be mad at me. I don't want this person to experience X, Y, and Z. And so he says, so here's the thing. And this was profound when he shared this with me a while back, is he says, if you if you do something for somebody because you don't want them to be mad, you're taking away their ability to work through something themselves.
Oh.
So you're
Yeah.
taking something from them. So he says you see the value in your own healing path, and when you know something is right for you, it might not be right for them in that moment, but in the bigger picture
It
it
will.
will be. And it's up to them to figure that out, because he says this also goes into your decisions. What are you saying yes to? What are you getting involved in? So he says that's a really important piece of it. And that takes time to work through that. But he goes, here's a couple things that we can do to validate ourselves and to help ourselves so that we're getting our own self validation. Because at the end of the day, he goes, a lot of things, because we are God, we are self realizing ourselves as God. So
Yes.
he says we validate ourselves, and it is something that truly works. And so he says, what can you do that you don't share with others that is good? He goes, so if you're one that, and he's giving an example, he goes, does everybody know the person that wants to grocery list all the good deeds they did? So he says, like, I did this for this person, I did this, I donated, I did this, I did this. And it's not, those are bad things, but he goes, it's that need to share it to get that outside validation. So he goes, if you are struggling with people pleasing, he goes, what if you do something and you say, well, I'm going to do this because it feels good to me, but I'm not going to tell anybody. And
Yeah.
that might be slipping $5 in somebody's mailbox for
Yeah.
a coffee. Or he says it can be something very simple. He's actually showing me like writing out little cue cards, like with a little message and leaving it in bathrooms, places.
Oh,
He's like, all these little things that you can do that he says feels good to do it. It feels good. And then he goes, when you hold that in as something that you've done, it's like between you and spirit. It's between you and the universe. And then you can sit and reflect in that energy, because he says sometimes, even when we have the best meaning things that we're doing and we want to share it because it feels so good that we did something, he goes, there can be somebody else that says, well, why did you do that? Now, why would you give your $5 to that person?
yeah.
And you're struggling with that. And then it starts to take away all of those
Oh, yeah.
good feelings that,
Right. Anonymous random deeds of kindness are
Mhm.
just so important. Very
Yes.
much so.
And he says, and practice validating yourself. He says, remember that no one on the outside of you is going to give you the validation that you think that you need from them. There'll be moments, and he says, we're not saying to, not have people that you share things with, but it's more like be discerning of what you share and when you share. And he says, and practice validating yourself when you do something, when you hit a milestone for yourself. He goes, why don't you sit and pat yourself on the back and sit in that energy first
Yeah.
before you jump out and want to share that outwards? Because he goes, the key is, if you practice this, and he goes, and I mean really practice it,
Yeah.
and he goes, and you really dig into it, you will find that that is the fast track to happiness. Now you might think, he says, that's not the fucking fast track, that's not it, that sounds like a lot of work. And he's like, but he goes, the truth is he says, your mind will tell you that's a lot of work. Your mind will tell you all
Yeah.
kinds of things, that this is useless. What's it really going to do? But he says, this is the way for us to truly feel happiness without the validation on the outside of us. So if somebody validates us, that's great. That feels great, but we're not attached to it.
Right.
We don't have to have it.
Yeah. So I think one identification of a people pleaser, if you want to know if you are, is if you do something good and oh, it just really bothers you that nobody is recognizing it. You know,
Yes.
nobody's saying it. They didn't notice. It's like putting the tip in the Starbucks jar, and so the person turns their head. The
Yeah.
barista says, "Oh God, now let me get that back out and wait till you look."
Yeah.
That sort of thing. You know.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Eric says exactly, Mom. That's exactly right.
But so people pleasing can be enabling to another person, but in a certain degree, there's a healthy amount of people pleasing, right? So it can be sort of a gift, right? So how do you know? How do you judge
Well,
whether
by
it's just the
how
right
it
amount?
feels. He goes, by how it feels. So he goes, it goes right back to when you're doing something, how does it make you feel? So he goes, you're doing something for somebody that, he goes, you want to see it without attachment. So what are you looking for in what you're doing? So he goes, ask why, and what am I looking for? So am I doing this for somebody because I'm secretly underneath expecting them to return the favor later?
Yeah,
Or he goes, really ask yourself those details. He goes, this takes a lot of getting honest with
yeah,
yourself. And he goes, now, if you are doing something with somebody and there is an expectation that's understood that there's something coming, then great. But he goes, but also recognize that there's nothing wrong with those times that you're really doing something for someone because you know they need it, or it
yeah,
feels right to do it.
yeah,
And it really doesn't matter whether they pat you on the back for it or give you a big shout out. He
yeah.
goes, that's the key to show you. But if you feel that you're giving and giving and giving and you feel depleted, he goes, you really want to take a look at that.
That's the whole thing of whether you're begging for pack approval or trying to just earn it with some
Yes.
meaningful contribution. That
Yes.
highlights it right there.
Yes. Yes.
Anything else, Eric?
No, he says, not really. He goes, people pleasing is a delicate dance. It's a
Yeah.
delicate dance, but he says he just wants to remind everybody that there is the upside of all of it, like what you just said, Mom. He goes, and also the understanding that we're able to have for others through the process when we can flip the switch and really look at the value of it all. And he says there's a lot of deep empowerment in this. So he says one other thing he'd like to add is about loneliness, because these practices with people pleasing also help with loneliness as well, when we can start to look at our own validation. And he says it will create more alignment and you'll feel more connected to the universe as
By
well.
not people pleasing, unhealthy in an
By
unhealthy way. Okay, got
by
it.
discerning, by
Oh,
going
okay.
through those things
Right.
that you're investigating. He says it
Okay.
really helps. It helps clear things, which does what? He says creates more clarity in your life.
Of course. That sounds great. Thank you, Michelle. You guys check her out down below in the description box. And be sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share to your fellow people pleasers. It will please them. And thank
Yes.
you, Erik. I love you.
Love you, Mom. He
Bye,
says, let's get to
everyone.
work.
Bye. Back to
Bye.
work. Yeah. Bye.